In the autumn of 1971, the air beneath Magic Kingdom Drive in Bay Lake, Florida, was cool and dry. On the ground floor of the resort, what the public calls the basement, but engineers know as the 9-acre Utilidor level, a single yellow and green stripe runs along a concrete wall, guiding costumed workers through the tunnels under Cinderella Castle. Overhead, insulated steam pipes and electrical conduits hum softly. Underfoot, the floor trembles as a vacuum tube pulls trash away at highway speed toward a buried processing room behind the future Splash Mountain site. Far above, on the second floor of this engineered landscape, Main Street USA glows in late afternoon light. Near the flagpole, a bronze plaque carries Walt Disney's dedication. Walt Disney World is a tribute to the philosophy and life of Walter Elias Disney, a promise of joy resting on a hidden machine. Where guests see a castle, engineers see fluorescent concrete and coated stripes. Both were built to last. Neither was built to be seen together. One day, when the illusions change and the systems are replaced, it may be the tunnel map, not the fireworks, that survives in the archive. In the early 1960s, long before Bay Lake, Florida, became a construction site, Walt Disney walked across Tomorrowland in Anaheim, California, and saw something that broke his illusion. According to later company lore and scholarship preserved in academic journals and business retrospectives, a Frontierland cowboy in full costume was cutting through the gleaming white architecture of Tomorrowland on his way to his assigned position. The fringe on his leather jacket caught the California sun. His spurs clicked against the modernist pavement. He belonged in a different story entirely, and for Walt Disney, a man whose entire career had been built on controlling what audiences saw and when they saw it, the moment represented a fundamental failure of theatrical discipline. The cowboy himself likely thought nothing of it. He was taking the shortest route between the employee parking lot and his post at the shooting gallery or the saloon show. He was saving time, preserving energy, and getting to work. But to Walt, watching from somewhere near the rocket to the moon or the Autopia track, the image shattered the carefully constructed boundary between the Old West and the space age. Years later, in interviews and recollections collected by Disney historians and preserved in corporate archives, Walt would return to this moment again and again, framing it not as a minor annoyance, but as a design failure that demanded a systemic solution. "I don't want the public to see the world they live in while they are in the park," he insisted in remarks recorded by colleagues and later cited in leadership training materials. "I want them to feel they're in another world." The cowboy in Tomorrowland became more than an anecdote. It became a parable, a founding legend for a new kind of architecture that would separate the performance from the machinery that sustained it. In the vocabulary of the Disney organization, it marked the distinction between on-stage and backstage, between the magic guests paid to see and the labor required to maintain that magic hour after hour, day after day, year after year. By 1965, as plans formed for a much larger resort in Central Florida, a property that would dwarf Disneyland in scale and ambition, that irritation hardened into design philosophy. At WED Enterprises in Glendale, California, designers such as John Hench, who had worked on Disneyland's visual vocabulary since the beginning, and layout specialists who had already learned to hide show buildings behind berms and carefully planted trees, now considered something more radical, a continuous service level where cast members, delivery vehicles, utility pipes, and trash removal would move entirely out of sight, not just hidden behind facades, but buried beneath the park itself. An internal background paper on Walt Disney World's philosophy, circulated around 1967 and later preserved in archival collections, described the Florida project not merely as a theme park, but as a planned environment, a kind of experimental prototype where utilities, traffic, and daily operations would be woven into the foundations rather than patched in afterward as afterthoughts. The document reflected Walt's broader ambitions for the Florida property, which extended far beyond entertainment into urban planning, transportation systems, and what he called the community of tomorrow. The theme park would be only the first phase, a proof of concept for a much larger vision. The cowboy in Tomorrowland, then, was not just a costume error. He represented the visible seam in a constructed reality, the moment when backstage leaked into the show. In Florida, there would be no such seams. Frontierland cowboys would walk only through Frontierland. Tomorrowland astronauts would emerge only in Tomorrowland. And the transition between these worlds, the long walk from the employee locker room to the assigned position, the delivery truck bringing fresh supplies, the janitor removing yesterday's trash, would happen in a parallel dimension, invisible to paying guests, engineered into the ground itself. Architecture, in this vision, would begin as a correction, a spatial answer to a narrative mistake. The desire to preserve theatrical illusion would become the pretext for building one of the world's largest utility tunnel systems, designed years before most guests even knew the Florida project existed. It was an infrastructure conceived not for efficiency alone, though efficiency would be a benefit, but for aesthetic control, for the preservation of a seamless fictional world where every sightline, every encounter, every sensory detail reinforced the story Disney wanted to tell. The tunnels would be the price of perfection, the hidden cost of a magic kingdom. On May 30th, 1967, bulldozers finally began to move sand and muck on remote land near Bay Lake, just southwest of Orlando, Florida. The property stretched across thousands of acres of wetland, pine forest, and undeveloped scrub, much of it purchased quietly through shell companies over the previous 2 years to avoid speculation and price inflation. For months, the true buyer's identity had been a subject of rumor and investigation by local journalists. When the Walt Disney Company finally confirmed its intentions in late 1965, the announcement transformed Central Florida's economic expectations overnight. To lead the physical transformation of this wilderness into buildable ground, Walt Disney recruited William Joe Potter, a retired Army Corps of Engineers general who had served as the governor of the Panama Canal Zone before consulting on logistics for the 1964 New York World's Fair, where he had worked closely with Disney on the company's pavilions. Potter's expertise in canals, drainage, and large-scale water management made him uniquely suited to the challenges of building a theme park on swampy Florida terrain, where the water table sat only inches below the surface and conventional excavation was impossible. Potter's first major task was to solve the fundamental problem that would shape everything else. Florida's geology would not permit traditional basement construction. Dig more than a few feet down, and water seeped in. The humid subtropical climate compounded the challenge, with frequent heavy rains and seasonal flooding that made underground spaces prone to moisture damage, mold, and structural instability. A conventional theme park built directly on grade would face these same problems, but it would also force all service functions, deliveries, trash removal, employee circulation, utility lines, onto the same level as the guest experience, exactly the visibility problem Walt had observed in California. Potter's solution, developed in close collaboration with WED's design team, inverted the problem entirely. Instead of digging down, they would build up. Using dredging equipment brought in for the project, crews excavated millions of cubic yards of soil and sand from the footprint of what would become Bay Lake and the Seven Seas Lagoon, creating two large bodies of water where none had existed before. The excavated material, muck, sand, clay, everything removed, was then used as fill to raise the central plateau where the Magic Kingdom would stand, lifting the entire park roughly 14 feet above the surrounding grade. This earthwork, which took more than a year and involved moving enough material to fill a small mountain, created a two-story architectural opportunity. The Utilidor level, the term was still being coined, a portmanteau of utility and corridor, would be built at the original ground level, forming a concrete network of hallways, service rooms, and utility passages. Then, on top of that network, a second layer of fill would be spread, creating an artificial ground plane, and the theme park itself would be constructed on this elevated surface. What guests would perceive as the ground floor would, in engineering terms, be the second story. The basement everyone would eventually hear about would actually be built at grade, with the park floating above it. Later, a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers pamphlet profiling Potter's post-military career would note his role as project manager for Disney World, emphasizing his pioneering work in underground utilities and integrated service systems for large-scale planned environments. The document placed his Florida work in the context of other major civil engineering projects of the 1960s, an era when ambitious infrastructure, interstate highways, urban renewal districts, new towns planned from scratch, reflected American confidence in technology's ability to reshape the landscape to human purposes. In planning drawings preserved in corporate archives and later studied by architecture scholars, the Utilidor footprint appears as a circular network of corridors beneath the central hub of the park, with radiating branches extending toward each themed land. Cinderella Castle, positioned at the center of this network, would rise as a kind of vertical axis, a landmark visible from every land, with its foundation planted in the Utilidor level and its towers soaring above the artificial ground plane. The recurring architectural motif that would come to define the system, a color-coded stripe painted along the tunnel walls, appears for the first time in these drawings, specified as a wayfinding device to help workers navigate a windowless maze where every corridor looked identical. The late 1960s were an era of megaprojects and technological optimism, when massive infrastructure investments promised to solve urban problems, connect distant regions, and reshape daily life. Disney's Florida venture echoed these broader cultural trends but redirected them toward an unusual purpose: not transportation or housing or industrial production, but entertainment, the creation of a fictional environment so controlled and complete that every functional necessity would be hidden from view. Where other cities of that era buried sewers and subway lines, Walt Disney Productions would bury an entire backstage city whose primary purpose was not efficiency but illusion, keeping the cowboy out of Tomorrowland, keeping the trash truck off Main Street, keeping the steam pipes and electrical transformers and employee break rooms invisible to anyone who had paid for admission. To build a magic kingdom, Joe Potter first built a concrete underworld. The architectural hierarchy was clear from the start. Fantasy would float above, visible and celebrated, while the pipes, trash compactors, and people in ordinary work clothes who sustained that fantasy would follow painted stripes along walls below, hidden as surely as the machinery backstage at a Broadway theater. The difference was scale. Broadway theaters had small wings and narrow catwalks. Disney World would have 9 acres of tunnels running beneath its Central Park, a service city as large as some small towns, entirely dedicated to maintaining the seamless operation of the world above. By the spring of 1969, as vertical construction began near Magic Kingdom Drive, the first sections of the Utilidor system rose on what looked, from outside the construction fence, like a low concrete box spreading across a sandy plain. Aerial photographs from that period, preserved in construction archives and occasionally republished in retrospective articles, show the rectangular network of walls and ceilings taking shape, with skeletal frameworks and exposed rebar visible against the scraped earth. It looked nothing like a theme park. It looked like a distribution warehouse, a parking structure, an industrial facility, which, in functional terms, is exactly what it was. Internally, WED Enterprises and the civil engineers coordinating construction began using a new term to describe this network: Utilidor, a portmanteau that combined utility and corridor into a single word that would eventually appear in technical reports, training manuals, and academic papers analyzing innovative infrastructure systems. A 2002 report by the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, surveying utility tunnel networks worldwide, would later list Walt Disney World as a prime example of large-scale Utilidor infrastructure, placing it in the same typological category as underground pedestrian networks in Arctic towns and dense urban districts where weather or geography made surface circulation impractical. By 1901, when the Magic Kingdom finally opened to the public, the Utilidors formed roughly 9 acres of circulation space, a figure that would be repeated in engineering literature and popular articles for decades afterward, always with a note of wonder at the sheer scale. The corridors themselves measured 15 feet in height, wide enough to accommodate electric service carts, small delivery trucks, and the occasional forklift moving equipment between storage areas and the theme park level above. The walls, poured concrete finished with industrial paint, carried the color-coded stripes that had been specified in the planning documents, different colors corresponding to different lands above, so that a cast member heading toward Fantasyland would follow one stripe, while another heading toward Frontierland would follow a different path entirely. Overhead, the ceilings bristled with infrastructure, electrical conduits, insulated steam pipes for heating and humidity control, compressed air lines, fire suppression sprinklers, telecommunications cables, and data conduits all ran along metal racks bolted to the concrete above. In some sections, these utility bundles grew so dense that maintenance crews would later need detailed maps just to trace individual lines from source to destination. The complexity reflected the park's ambitions. This was not merely a network of hallways, but a complete utility plant, distributing power, climate control, communications, and more to every corner of the park above through vertical risers and carefully concealed connections. In construction photographs and engineering diagrams from this period, the space looks nothing like a castle basement or a medieval undercroft. It is a horizontal plant room, a logistical machine built for function rather than aesthetics, punctuated by heavy industrial doors leading to specialized rooms, costuming departments where tens of thousands of garments would be stored and distributed, refrigeration units supplying cold storage for food service operations, maintenance shops equipped with workbenches, tools, and spare parts for rides and attractions, and a future control room that would house the Digital Animation Control System, or DAX, which would eventually synchronize audio-animatronic figures, lighting cues, and parade timing from behind the scenes, invisible to guests, but essential to the park's operation. A later academic article analyzing the Walt Disney World underground, published in journals examining theme park architecture and urban planning, would describe the system as an underworld of pipes and people that makes the surface seem weightless. The metaphor captured something essential about the relationship between the two levels. The Utilidor absorbed all the weight of logistics, infrastructure, and labor, leaving the surface level free to focus entirely on aesthetics, narrative, and guest experience. It was a form of architectural sleight of hand, redirecting attention away from the mechanics of operation toward the carefully designed surfaces that constituted the show. On early floor plans preserved in corporate archives and occasionally reproduced in books about Disney's design philosophy, the color-coded stripe along the wall appears as a simple legend, a thin line marked with labels like Main Street, Tomorrowland, Fantasyland. In operation, however, that stripe would become something more significant, the navigational lifeline that prevented thousands of workers from getting lost in a labyrinth where every corridor looked identical, where natural light never penetrated, and where the only reference points were the painted bands running along the concrete at shoulder height. The design team understood that workers would be moving through these spaces dozens of times per day, often in a hurry, sometimes while pushing heavy carts or carrying awkward equipment. The stripe system had to be intuitive, visible from a distance, and consistent throughout the network. It had to work for new employees on their first day and for veterans who had walked these halls for years. And it had to function even when the corridors were crowded, when the lights were dim, when someone was tired at the end of a long shift and just wanted to find the exit. What had begun years earlier as a story about a misplaced cowboy walking through the wrong-themed land had, by 1969, hardened into poured concrete, welded steel, and miles of painted stripes. The problem Walt Disney had identified in California, the visibility of backstage functions in a space meant to sustain theatrical illusion, had been solved through a radical architectural intervention, building the entire park one level above the ground, creating a hidden city below where all the necessary but unmagical work could happen out of sight. When the park opened to guests in October 1971, most visitors would walk across Main Street, gaze up at Cinderella Castle, and never realize they were standing on the roof of a utility tunnel network, carefully mapped in colors that only cast members would ever see. On October 1, 1971, the first guests crossed under the Victorian-style railroad station into the Magic Kingdom in Bay Lake, Florida, without realizing they were ascending to the second floor of a carefully engineered park. The entry sequence had been designed to obscure this transition. Guests walked through a tunnel beneath the railroad berm, emerged onto the north end of Main Street, USA, and found themselves in what felt like a ground-level small-town street scene, complete with storefronts, cobblestones, and the distant silhouette of Cinderella Castle framed at the far end of the boulevard. Nothing in the visual design suggested that they were standing 14 feet above the surrounding Florida landscape, walking on a constructed platform built atop a buried service city. Upstairs, though no one called it that, television cameras and newspaper photographers framed Cinderella Castle, designed under the creative direction of John Hench, as the park's iconic centerpiece. Hench, who had worked with Walt since the early days of animation and had shaped much of Disneyland's visual language, understood the castle not merely as a building but as a symbol, a vertical landmark that organized the park's spatial hierarchy and created a sense of anticipation from the moment guests entered. The castle's proportions had been carefully calculated to appear larger than it actually was, using forced perspective and tapering architectural details to create an illusion of height and grandeur. Downstairs, on the Utilidor level invisible to those crowds and cameras, cast members in freshly issued costumes rushed along the color-striped tunnels toward their assigned positions, guided by laminated orientation maps distributed during training and by the painted bands running along the concrete walls at eye level. For many of these workers, October Argo marked their first real shift after weeks of rehearsals and technical previews. The tunnels, which had seemed vast and empty during training, now filled with foot traffic, voices echoing off hard surfaces, and the ambient hum of ventilation systems working to keep the air breathable in a space with no windows and limited circulation. From the outset, the hidden infrastructure served not only logistical functions, but narrative discipline. A training publication distributed to new employees framed the operational philosophy in theatrical terms. The theme park was divided into on-stage and backstage zones, with the utilidors explicitly labeled as backstage areas where the Disney look, the company's strict grooming and appearance standards, could be temporarily relaxed. In the tunnels, character performers could walk without their costume heads, which were heavy and hot and made it nearly impossible to see or breathe. Maintenance workers could carry tools and equipment without breaking the themed aesthetic of the lands above. Food service employees could transport supplies without guests, seeing industrial carts loaded with plastic-wrapped ingredients. The distinction between onstage and backstage was not merely descriptive, but prescriptive, a set of rules that governed behavior, movement, and even speech. Cast members were expected to stay in character while on stage, maintaining the fiction that they inhabited the world guests had paid to enter. Backstage, in the tunnels, they could speak freely, complain about sore feet, eat a quick snack between shifts, and exist as ordinary workers rather than performers. The Utilidor system, then, functioned as more than physical infrastructure. It was a social and psychological boundary, a space where the demands of the show could be temporarily set aside. Roy Disney's dedication of the resort, later that month, preserved on a bronze plaque near the flagpole on Main Street and recorded in company histories, spoke of the property as a tribute to the philosophy and life of Walter Elias Disney, a promise that the values Walt had articulated, optimism, innovation, storytelling, would be embedded in this Florida landscape. Roy's decision to rename the entire resort Walt Disney World rather than the originally planned Disney World reflected his desire to memorialize his brother, who had died in December 1966, nearly 5 years before the park opened. That name, stamped on tickets and maps and souvenirs, tied the entire property, including its buried systems and hidden architecture, to Walt's vision of controlled, seamless entertainment. Yet the dedication made no mention of the utilidors, the AVAC trash system, or the color-coded tunnels that made the surface operation possible. These were backstage details, engineering solutions to practical problems, not the kind of poetry that belonged in a speech about inspiration and dreams. The plaque commemorated the castle, the fantasy, the promise of joy. It said nothing about the concrete corridors below or the thousands of workers who would spend their days navigating them. On that first day in October, the park embodied a dual promise that would define its operation for decades to come. Joy on the surface, rigorously managed and aesthetically perfect. Order underneath, invisible, but essential. For every photograph of a child meeting Mickey Mouse in front of Cinderella Castle, there was a Utilidor corridor humming unseen beneath their feet, and a painted stripe on the wall showing a cast member in a mouse costume where to turn to reach the hub at the end of Main Street. Both levels, the magical and the mechanical, were necessary, but only one was meant to be remembered. Only one appeared in the advertisements and the postcards, and the home movies families would watch years later, remembering the day they visited the most famous theme park on Earth. The architecture had done its work. It had separated the show from the machinery, the narrative from the labor, the fantasy from the infrastructure. Guests walking across the park felt the seamless immersion Walt had demanded, unaware that every step took them across the roof of a Utilidor network designed specifically to keep that machinery out of sight. The cowboy would never walk through Tomorrowland again. He would walk through a tunnel marked with a yellow stripe, emerge through a concealed door, and appear on Frontierland's dusty streets exactly where the story required him to be. The illusion, finally, was complete. By the late 1970s, on a typical morning beneath Main Street U.S.A., the Utilidors felt less like an architectural novelty and more like the rush-hour corridors of a small industrial town buried under a theme park. Cast members arrived before dawn at the West Clock parking lot, one of several large lots scattered across the Disney property, and rode shuttle buses to designated back-of-house entrances, stepping directly into the tunnel system without ever seeing the park's public spaces. From there, they fanned out along the color-coded corridors toward their assigned departments: costuming, food service, attractions operations, custodial, merchandise, maintenance. The tunnel network at this hour was a river of human traffic: polyester costumes in garment bags, rolling carts loaded with cleaning supplies, maintenance workers carrying toolboxes, and character performers heading toward designated areas to put on the foam heads and padded bodysuits that would transform them into recognizable figures from animated films. Voices bounced off concrete walls. Fluorescent tubes overhead, running the length of each corridor, cast a flat, shadowless light that never changed, regardless of whether it was dawn or midday or midnight on the surface above. Time, in the Utilidors, became an abstract concept marked by shift schedules rather than the position of the sun. The Mouseketeria Cafeteria, a large employee dining area located on the Utilidor level, served as a social hub where cast members from different departments could eat together during breaks, temporarily setting aside their onstage personas. Nearby, the costuming department managed an inventory of tens of thousands of garments, uniforms for every role and themed land, duplicates and backups to ensure that someone could always step in if a costume was damaged or soiled, specialized pieces for parades and seasonal events, all stored in climate-controlled rooms along the tunnel's edge. Locker rooms, where cast members stored personal belongings and changed before and after shifts, lined other corridors, marked with simple numbers and letters rather than the whimsical names used in the park above. A Business Insider report published decades later, drawing on interviews with former cast members in company publications, would describe the Utilidors as containing dressing rooms, staff cafeterias, security offices, prop storage, and a massive wardrobe with 40,000 costumes, emphasizing how this underground city kept delivery trucks, trash haulers, and the visual evidence of labor away from paying guests. Photographs published in training materials from this era show metal racks holding hundreds of costumes under fluorescent lighting with the color-coded wall stripes visible at the edge of frame. Never the focus of the image, always background texture, a functional detail that helped workers orient themselves in a maze where every corridor looked structurally identical. Disney's internal language, codified in training programs and employee handbooks, reinforced the theatrical metaphor that governed daily operations. Employees were cast members rather than workers. Public areas were on stage rather than the park. The Utilidor network and other restricted zones were backstage rather than off-limits. This vocabulary was not merely corporate jargon, but a deliberate psychological tool, a way of framing hourly labor as performance art and encouraging workers to see themselves as essential contributors to a larger narrative rather than interchangeable service employees. In one frequently quoted reflection preserved in company publications and design retrospectives, John Hench, who had shaped much of the park's visual vocabulary, remarked that standing in front of Cinderella Castle meant that every one of our senses are coming into play, insisting that the total experience, the sight lines, the color palette, the ambient sounds, the carefully controlled scale and proportion, could never be fully captured on film or conveyed in photographs. The designed environment, in Hench's view, worked because it surrounded guests completely, managing every stimulus to reinforce the narrative and emotional goals of each themed land. Below, in the tunnels, the senses narrowed dramatically. The smell of industrial floor cleaner mixed with the scent of food being transported from central kitchens to onstage restaurants. The buzz of fluorescent lights provided a constant ambient drone. The concrete floor felt hard underfoot after hours of standing or walking, the kind of surface that caused fatigue and soreness by the end of a long shift. There were no sightlines to distant castles, no carefully orchestrated soundscapes of cheerful music and birdsong. The utilidors were designed for pure function, get workers and supplies from point A to point B as efficiently as possible, keep them out of sight, and minimize the chance that anyone in costume would ever be seen by guests in the wrong context. Yet, for the cast members themselves, the utilidors gradually became something more than functional corridors. They became familiar territory, a space where inside jokes circulated, where friendships formed during shared breaks in the mousqueteria, where institutional knowledge, which doors led where, which routes avoided congestion during shift changes, where to find a quiet spot to sit for 5 minutes, accumulated over months and years of daily navigation. The painted stripes on the walls, initially just wayfinding tools, became landmarks in personal mental maps, reference points in stories told to new hires trying to learn their way around. The architecture's meaning, by the late 1970s, had begun to shift. The utilidor stripe was no longer simply a design flourish or an engineering detail specified in planning documents. It had become a traffic signal for labor, an organizing principle embedded in concrete and paint that helped thousands of people per day vanish from the story they were paid to sustain. The more invisible the tunnel city became to guests enjoying a day at the Magic Kingdom, the more essential it proved to the choreography of the park's daily operation. Without these corridors and the workers who used them, the fantasy above would collapse within hours. Trash would pile up, costumes would go undistributed, characters would miss their scheduled appearances, food would run out, the machinery would grind to a halt, and the seams between illusion and reality, exactly the seams Walt Disney had wanted to eliminate, would become visible to everyone. The utilidors ensured that those seams remained hidden. The price was that thousands of workers spent their days in fluorescent corridors, following painted lines on concrete walls, invisible to the guests whose joy depended on their invisible labor. Starting in 1971, in a service room just off the Utilidor ring near what would later become the site of Splash Mountain, trash began to disappear at 60 miles per hour through a network of pneumatic tubes buried beneath the Magic Kingdom. Disney had installed an automated vacuum collection system known by its acronym AVAC, originally developed in Sweden and used in a handful of European planned communities where aesthetic concerns or space constraints made traditional trash collection impractical. Walt Disney World became one of the earliest American sites to deploy this technology at municipal scale, turning waste removal into an invisible, nearly silent process that operated continuously beneath the park's surface. The system worked through a combination of pneumatic pressure and carefully engineered infrastructure. Throughout the park's public areas, custodial cast members emptied trash cans into sealed intake hatches, small doors built into themed facades disguised to blend into the visual environment of each land. From these intake points, refuse fell into vertical chutes that connected to the utilidor level network below. At programmed intervals, industrial fans in the central AVAC plant created negative pressure in the pipes, generating powerful suction that pulled trash through the tubes at highway speeds toward a central collection facility, where it was automatically compacted, sorted, and prepared for removal from the property. Company press materials describing the system during the park's opening year framed AVAC as a model for communities of the future, echoing Walt Disney's broader ambitions for the Florida property, which had originally included plans for an experimental prototype community of tomorrow, Epcot, where new technologies would solve urban problems and demonstrate better ways of living. The promotional language promised not just efficiency, but transformation. Cleaner streets, quieter neighborhoods, the elimination of garbage trucks rumbling through residential areas. Waste, in this vision, would simply vanish into concealed hatches, transported invisibly to central processing facilities located out of sight and mind. Academic and popular writers examining the history of the AVAC system decades later would note the irony embedded in this promise. Outside of a few experimental installations, airports, hospitals, dense urban districts in Scandinavia, the technology did not transform American cities or reshape municipal waste management. It proved expensive to install, complex to maintain, and practical only in controlled environments where infrastructure could be planned from the beginning rather than retrofitted into existing buildings and streets. Yet at Walt Disney World, the system continues to operate daily, handling tons of waste with minimal surface visibility, exactly as designed more than 50 years ago. In the Utilidor, the AVAC infrastructure occupies dedicated rooms marked only by functional labels and warning signs. High air pressure, authorized personnel only, hearing protection required when the system is active. When the fans engage and suction begins, a low roar of rushing air fills these chambers and a brief shudder passes through the walls as tons of refuse accelerate through the pipes toward the processing plant. Workers in adjacent corridors, pushing carts or walking toward their assigned positions, have learned to recognize the sound, a distant mechanical growl, quickly fading, as background noise, as much a part of the Utilidor's acoustic environment as the hum of HVAC systems and the echo of footsteps on concrete. The color-coded stripe on the Utilidor walls runs past these AVAC rooms without deviation, guiding workers along their assigned routes, while the waste management system operates parallel to human circulation, but entirely separate from it. Upstairs, on Main Street USA, or in Tomorrowland or anywhere else in the park, a curb remains spotless. A custodial cast member empties a trash can into a hatch, the door closes, and within seconds the waste has vanished into the tunnel network below, pulled toward the processing center at speeds that would be dangerous if the pipes weren't carefully sealed and monitored. The only sound a guest might notice if they stood very still near an intake point at the exact moment the system fired would be a faint rush of air, easily mistaken for wind or the ambient noise of a theme park filled with thousands of people. Here, the Utilidor architecture serves a moral choice as much as a technical one. To preserve the illusion of effortless cleanliness, to maintain the fantasy that a place visited by tens of thousands of people per day could remain perpetually pristine without visible evidence of waste removal. Disney invested in buried pipes, industrial fans, and negative air pressure systems rather than allowing conventional garbage trucks to enter the park's public spaces. The decision reflected the same aesthetic discipline that had driven the Utilidor's design from the beginning. Anything that broke the themed illusion, anything that reminded guests of the ordinary world they had paid to escape, had to be eliminated or hidden. Decades later, the AVAC system would be cited in engineering papers and transportation research reports as a case study in hidden infrastructure, an example of how planned environments could integrate advanced waste management technologies to achieve aesthetic and operational goals impossible with conventional methods. A 2002 report by the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, surveying utility tunnel systems worldwide, noted that Walt Disney World's Utilidors housed not only circulation corridors and utility distribution, but also an automated vacuum collection system for waste, situating the installation within a broader typology of subterranean infrastructure that included subway systems, underground shopping districts, and Arctic town tunnels designed to protect pedestrians from extreme weather. Yet for most visitors to the Magic Kingdom, then and now, the AVAC system remains completely unknown. They see clean parks and empty trash cans. They experience a carefully maintained environment where waste seems never to accumulate, where the evidence of thousands of people eating and drinking and discarding wrappers and cups and half-finished meals somehow never becomes visible. The system works precisely because it is invisible, because its existence contradicts the fantasy of a timeless, effortlessly perfect kingdom. Guests are not meant to think about where the trash goes or how it gets there. They are meant to think about castles and princesses and parades, secure in the knowledge that someone else, somewhere else, out of sight and out of mind, has taken care of the messy details. That somewhere is the Utilidor. That someone follows the painted stripe on the wall to the AVAC control room, monitors pressure gauges and system diagnostics, and ensures that when the next trash can is emptied into the next intake hatch, the waste will vanish at 60 miles per hour into the hidden infrastructure of the Magic Kingdom. By the 1980s and 1990s, as Walt Disney World expanded from a single theme park into a sprawling resort complex covering thousands of acres and attracting tens of millions of visitors per year, the Utilidors remained concentrated beneath the original Magic Kingdom in Bay Lake. The dream that had once seemed implicit in their design, that every future park would include a similar buried network, that the Utilidor concept would become standard Disney infrastructure, quietly receded under pressure from financial realities and logistical complexity. When Epcot Center opened in October 1982, visitors found a park built on very different principles than the Magic Kingdom. Rather than a central hub with radiating lands, Epcot consisted of two distinct zones: Future World, with large pavilions sponsored by corporations and dedicated to themes like energy, transportation, and imagination, and World Showcase, a lagoon ringed by pavilions representing different nations. The scale was enormous. Epcot covered more than twice the land area of the Magic Kingdom, but its Utilidor network proved far more limited. A small tunnel system ran beneath Spaceship Earth, the geodesic sphere that served as the park's icon, and connected some buildings in the Future World section. But most backstage functions relied on conventional service roads, carefully screened from guest view by landscaping and berms, but fundamentally different from the comprehensive underground network that defined the Magic Kingdom. Disney MGM Studios, which opened in May 1989 as a working film and television production facility combined with a theme park, included even less Utilidor infrastructure. The park's design incorporated visible backstage elements. Guests toured sound stages and saw behind-the-scenes demonstrations as part of the park's educational mission about filmmaking, which made hiding all infrastructure less essential. Service roads, screened but not buried, handled most logistics. Internal planning documents and budget discussions from this period, referenced in retrospective analyses by theme park historians and business scholars, reveal that the decision to limit Utilidor construction in later parks stemmed from cost-benefit analysis rather than any philosophical shift away from Walt's original vision. The Magic Kingdom's Utilidor system had been extraordinarily expensive to build, requiring massive earth-moving, extensive concrete work, complex utility integration, and ongoing ventilation and maintenance to keep underground corridors safe and functional. Those costs might be justified for the flagship park, the centerpiece of the entire resort, but extending the same infrastructure to every new gate proved economically difficult to justify, especially as the company faced pressure from shareholders and corporate leadership to control expenses and demonstrate return on investment. As a result, the Magic Kingdom Utilidor became what engineers and architects call a one-off, an exceptional case rather than a replicable template. Engineering articles and theme park design studies published in academic journals over the following decades consistently cited the Walt Disney World Utilidors as a remarkable example of hidden infrastructure, noting both their technical sophistication and their unique status. No other Disney park, not even those built from scratch on undeveloped land where Utilidor integration would have been theoretically easier, replicated the system at comparable scale. At the same time, broader discussions of aging infrastructure in the United States and other developed nations began to stress the challenges of maintaining complex buried systems built decades earlier. Highway overpasses, water mains, sewer systems, and electrical conduits installed during the post-war boom were reaching the end of their original design life, requiring expensive rehabilitation or replacement. Utility tunnel networks, though typically well-built and durable, faced similar pressures: corrosion of pipes and cables, obsolescence of older technologies, difficulty of access for repairs and upgrades, and the ongoing challenge of integrating new systems, fiber optic cables, digital controls, updated fire suppression, into structures designed around the technical standards of an earlier era. The Magic Kingdom Utilidors, while presumably well maintained by Disney's extensive facilities management teams, were subject to the same forces. The concrete corridors and utility racks built in the late 1960s and early 1970s reflected the technologies and codes of that period. As the park above evolved, adding new attractions, upgrading audio and lighting systems, installing digital controls and computer networks, the Utilidor infrastructure had to adapt. Conduits were added to existing racks, cable runs grew denser, equipment rooms accumulated layers of technology, new systems installed alongside older ones that remained in service. In promotional materials and press releases from the 1980s and 1990s, the Walt Disney Company highlighted new attractions, themed lands, resort hotels, and entertainment districts, not the aging tunnel network that continued to serve the original park. The Utilidor stripe that had once embodied the cutting edge of themed infrastructure, a bold solution to an aesthetic problem, an architectural innovation that separated Disney's approach from conventional amusement park design, now led through corridors whose dimensions and routing had been fixed by decisions made decades earlier, during the Nixon administration, in an era before personal computers, before digital animation, before the global expansion of the Disney brand into Asia and Europe. Decline, in this context, did not mean collapse or failure. The Utilidors continued to function as designed, moving thousands of cast members per day along color-coded routes, distributing utilities throughout the park, housing AVAC equipment and costuming departments and break rooms. Maintenance crews repainted the stripes when paint flaked. Facilities teams repaired broken fluorescent fixtures and patched concrete where decades of cart traffic had caused surface damage. The system worked. But decline meant something else. A shift in relative importance, a gradual recognition that the unique undercity beneath the Magic Kingdom, once imagined as the template for a new kind of theme park architecture, would remain singular, never fully repeated, preserved in operation, but sidelined in expansion plans. As the resort's surface multiplied and diversified, adding parks and hotels and shopping districts and transportation systems across an area larger than Manhattan, the 9 acres of tunnels beneath the original castle became, paradoxically, both legendary and peripheral. Everyone in the theme park industry knew about them. Articles and documentaries routinely mentioned them as evidence of Disney's commitment to detail and guest experience. But as a practical matter, they were specific to one park, built in one era, under one set of conditions that would never quite recur. The architecture endured, but its centrality to Disney's operational philosophy quietly faded, replaced by more flexible, less expensive approaches to backstage management that accepted some visibility of service functions in exchange for lower capital costs and easier adaptation to changing needs. The Utilidor remained, as it had always been, a solution to the problem of the cowboy walking through Tomorrowland. It just turned out that most theme parks, even those built by Disney, could solve that problem with carefully placed fences, service roads screened by landscaping, and scheduling rules that kept costume characters away from incongruous locations. Only the Magic Kingdom needed 9 acres of buried corridors to keep the story intact. By the early 2000s, a guest standing on Main Street USA could pay extra for a very particular privilege, the chance to walk, briefly and under controlled conditions, along the same Utilidor corridors once reserved entirely for cast members. Disney's Keys to the Kingdom tour, restricted to adults and offered only a limited number of times per day, began providing curated access to portions of the tunnel network, framing the experience as a behind-the-scenes educational opportunity that revealed the hidden machinery sustaining the park's seamless operation. The tour represented a significant philosophical shift in how the company treated backstage spaces. For 30 years after the park opened, the utilidors had remained strictly off-limits to guests, a boundary enforced not just by locked doors and security protocols but by the fundamental premise that anything breaking the theatrical illusion, including knowledge of the infrastructure that made that illusion possible, had to be kept hidden. Cast members signed agreements acknowledging that disclosure of backstage information could result in termination. Guests who somehow found their way into restricted areas were promptly escorted out and sometimes banned from the property. The introduction of the Keys to the Kingdom tour relaxed that boundary in carefully managed ways. The company's own promotional materials emphasized that the tunnels remained firmly backstage. Only a narrow route and selected rooms would be included in the tour, with significant portions of the Utilidor network staying off-limits. Guests were asked not to photograph certain areas, maintaining some degree of mystery even within the curated revelation. And the tour itself became an explicitly educational experience, complete with scripted narratives that explained not just what guests were seeing, but why it had been designed that way. Guide scripts, preserved indirectly through participant accounts shared on enthusiast blogs and travel forums, followed a consistent structure. They began with the origin legend of the cowboy in Tomorrowland, explaining how Walt Disney's frustration with that costume error in California had led to the radical architectural solution beneath the Magic Kingdom. They described the onstage-backstage distinction, using theatrical metaphor to frame the Utilidor not as industrial infrastructure, but as the wings of a vast stage, the place where performers prepared, rested, and moved between scenes. They demonstrated the AVAC trash system, sometimes triggering a suction cycle so guests could hear the rush of air and understand the scale of the pneumatic network. They showed the costuming department, racks of garments organized by land and roll, and explained the logistics of keeping thousands of cast members properly dressed each day. Throughout the tour, guests saw the color-coded stripes on the walls, the electric carts moving supplies along the corridors, the cabled ceilings heavy with decades of utility infrastructure. They walked the same paths that cast members walked dozens of times per day. They experienced the flat fluorescent light, the hard concrete floors, the ambient sounds of ventilation and distant machinery. But they experienced it all through narration, through a guide explaining and contextualizing everything, transforming the raw functionality of the tunnels into a story about Disney innovation, efficiency, and attention to detail. In this shift, the Utilidor moved from pure secrecy to curated revelation. It became a form of intellectual property in itself, an experience that could be booked, priced, and narrated. What had once been designed to vanish from public knowledge, to remain so completely invisible that guests never questioned how trash disappeared or where cast members came from, now required its own storytelling layer, complete with carefully crafted anecdotes, safety briefings, and timed transitions between the sunlit park and the fluorescent tunnels below. The transformation reflected broader changes in how Disney thought about its brand. By the 2000s, the company had begun to recognize that some guests wanted more than just the surface fantasy. They wanted to understand how it worked. They wanted insider knowledge, access to creative processes, the satisfaction of seeing behind the curtain. This audience, often adult Disney enthusiasts, repeat visitors who had experienced all the attractions multiple times, people interested in design and engineering and corporate history, represented a lucrative market segment that could be served without undermining the magic for first-time visitors and families with young children who preferred the illusion intact. The Keys to the Kingdom tour served this market. It acknowledged that the Utilidors existed, that the park ran on hidden infrastructure, that thousands of workers moved through tunnels painted with colored stripes. But it did so in a way that reinforced rather than undermined Disney's narrative about itself. The tunnels weren't evidence of exploitation or invisible labor or the industrial machinery required to manufacture joy. They were evidence of genius, innovation, commitment to guest experience. Walt's vision, translated into concrete and paint, demonstrated that Disney was willing to spend millions on infrastructure most guests would never see, all in service of maintaining a seamless illusion above. The color-coded stripe that had once been a purely functional wayfinding tool, specified by engineers, painted by contractors, maintained by facilities crews, noticed primarily by lost cast members trying to figure out which way to turn, now appeared in tour photographs, mentioned in blog posts, featured in articles about Disney's hidden secrets. It became a visual symbol of the Utilidor concept itself, a small detail that stood in for the entire network, recognizable to anyone who had taken the tour or seen pictures online. Every mark on the concrete floor where tour groups paused to listen, every comparison between the printed map in a guide's hand and the painted stripe on the wall signaled a quiet reversal. The architecture built to hide itself had become an attraction. The underworld of pipes and people, designed to remain invisible and forgotten, had become a managed memory that the company could reveal or withhold depending on market opportunity and brand strategy. The Utilidors had always been essential to the park's operation. Now they were also part of its story, a layer of backstage authenticity that could be selectively exposed to guests willing to pay for the privilege of understanding how the magic worked. And yet, even within this revelation, secrecy persisted. Guests saw only what the tour route included. Large sections of the network remained off-limits. Cameras were forbidden in some areas. Cast members working in the tunnels during tour hours kept their distance or ducked into side corridors, maintaining the boundary between guided experience and daily operation. The Utilidor, even when revealed, was only partially revealed. Some doors stayed closed, some corridors stayed dark. Some aspects of the machinery that sustained the Magic Kingdom remained hidden, preserved not because they were secret but because revealing everything would eliminate the mystique that made the tour valuable in the first place. After about 2010, long after the Magic Kingdom celebrated its 40th anniversary and moved toward its 50th, the most detailed views of the Utilidor system no longer came from company training manuals or controlled tour routes, but from computer screens in living rooms around the world. Enthusiast websites, online forums, and theme park history blogs began circulating scanned Utilidor maps, construction photographs from the 1960s, and annotated diagrams showing the relationship between surface lands and underground corridors. What had once existed primarily as institutional knowledge, information shared among cast members, preserved in corporate archives, occasionally glimpsed by tour participants, became widely available public knowledge, distributed through digital networks that Disney could not fully control. Technical papers published in academic journals and transportation research reports added to this dissemination. A 2002 study by the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, examining utility tunnel systems worldwide, described the Walt Disney World Utilidors in systematic detail. Approximately 9 acres of underground network, corridors 15 feet high and wide enough for service vehicles, containing meeting rooms, computer rooms, costume storage, cafeterias, break rooms, and an automated vacuum collection system for waste. The paper placed Disney's infrastructure in a typology alongside Arctic town tunnels, urban pedestrian networks, and hospital service corridors, treating the Magic Kingdom as a case study in integrated utility distribution, rather than as a proprietary secret. Journalists writing listicles for online publications labeled the Utilidors a secret underground city, a phrase that captured public imagination, even as more careful articles explained that the tunnels were not truly underground, not excavated below grade, but built at ground level and buried under fill excavated from the Seven Seas Lagoon. This technical distinction mattered to engineers and architects, but less so to general audiences, for whom the essential fact was invisibility. There was an entire city beneath the castle, miles of corridors that most visitors would never see, a parallel world that made the surface world possible. In photographs that leaked through unofficial channels or were released through official media in carefully controlled contexts, the color-coded stripe reappeared again and again. It became a visual shorthand for the entire Utilidor concept, a thin band of pigment standing in for 9 acres of buried infrastructure. amateur photographers who managed to sneak camera phones onto tour routes, professional journalists granted rare access for documentary projects, and official Disney publicity materials all framed shots that included the stripe, recognizing its iconic status. The stripe was simultaneously mundane, just paint on a concrete wall, a maintenance detail requiring periodic touch-up, and symbolically loaded, representing the hidden order that undergirded the visible magic. As a result of this digital proliferation, millions of people who had never walked the Utilidor corridors and likely never would could now picture them with reasonable accuracy. They knew about the color coding, the AVAC hatches, the costume storage rooms, the cafeteria, the narrow passages where cast members in character costume hurried toward stage entrances. They had seen diagrams showing how Main Street connected to the hub, how Fantasyland and Tomorrowland and Liberty Square each had designated corridor zones, how the system formed a rough circle beneath the Central Park with radiating branches and cross-connections. The Utilidor became a mental map, an imagined space constructed from fragments of information gathered online. YouTube videos narrated virtual tours using animation and archived photographs. Online forums debated precise routing and argued over which doors led where. Enthusiast sites collected and analyzed every available scrap of documentation, building comprehensive reconstructions of a space most participants had never experienced firsthand. In some ways, this crowdsourced knowledge base became more detailed than any single document Disney had ever publicly released, though less detailed than the internal facilities management drawings that remained proprietary. This transformation of the Utilidors from hidden infrastructure to open secret, from proprietary information to public knowledge, occurred gradually and without any single decisive moment of disclosure. It reflected broader cultural shifts in how information moved in the digital age, how secrets eroded through accumulation of small leaks in legitimate publications, how companies lost control over narratives about their own operations as employees, journalists, academics, and enthusiasts assembled alternative accounts from scattered sources. Disney adapted to this reality by managing disclosure rather than attempting to maintain absolute secrecy. The keys to the Kingdom Tour acknowledged the Utilidors while controlling what guests saw and how they understood it. Official histories and anniversary publications mentioned the system's existence and basic functions. Press materials occasionally referenced the innovative infrastructure when talking about Disney's commitment to guest experience. The company accepted that the Utilidors were now part of public knowledge, part of the Disney mythology that enthusiasts loved to discuss and analyze, while still maintaining operational control and keeping large sections of the network off limits. Here, disappearance took a new form. The Utilidor's physical invisibility persisted. Guests walking through the Magic Kingdom still could not see the tunnels below, still experienced a seamless surface world that gave no obvious indication of the buried network. But its conceptual secrecy eroded into a kind of widespread familiarity. The hidden infrastructure of the 20th century, designed before the internet, before smartphones, before the assumption that information would eventually leak and spread, now survived as data as much as concrete. Technical specifications preserved in journal articles, photographs circulating on image boards, animated schematics on educational YouTube channels, discussion threads analyzing every detail of construction and operation. The painted stripe on the wall, once visible only to the cast members who followed it through windowless corridors during daily commutes between locker rooms and stage entrances, now appeared on screens worldwide, photographed and shared and analyzed. It had become an image detached from its original purely functional purpose, transformed into a symbol that meant something different depending on who looked at it and what they wanted it to represent. Disney innovation, hidden labor, architectural ingenuity, corporate control, backstage authenticity, manufactured magic. In archives both official and unofficial, the Utilidors existed in parallel forms, as operating infrastructure requiring daily maintenance and adaptation, as historical artifact documented in construction photos and engineering drawings, as cultural phenomenon discussed in theme park forums and Disney history books, as tourist attraction on guided tours, as intellectual property carefully managed through selective disclosure. as digital reconstruction assembled from fragments by enthusiasts who would never walk those corridors but could describe them in detail. The architecture had not disappeared, but it had multiplied into versions, each with different meanings, different audiences, different relationships to secrecy and revelation. The tunnels built in the 1960s to solve the problem of a misplaced cowboy now existed as concrete corridors beneath Florida, as technical specifications in transportation research papers, as images on screens, as stories told by tour guides, as mental maps in the minds of millions who had never been there but knew exactly what the color-coded stripes looked like. On a quiet afternoon in the 2020s, in a university library reading room far from Bay Lake, Florida, a graduate student researching post-war American leisure architecture unfolds a large, aging photocopy labeled Magic Kingdom Utility Corridor Schematic, circa 1970. The document, obtained through interlibrary loan from a collection of theme park planning materials, shows the Utilidor network as a series of intersecting lines with color codes marked in faded annotations along each corridor segment. It is not the original drawing that remains in corporate archives, accessible only to Disney facilities management and historians with appropriate clearance. But it conveys the essential information: layout, scale, connections between surface lands and underground infrastructure, the organizing logic of a hidden city. Academic studies of subterranean space, published over the past 2 decades in journals focused on architecture, urban planning, and cultural studies, now routinely cite the Walt Disney World Utilidor, alongside other examples of underground infrastructure. Subway systems, shopping arcades beneath Tokyo and Montreal, utility tunnels serving university campuses and hospital complexes, and the buried corridors of Arctic towns in Scandinavia and Canada, where winter temperatures make surface pedestrian circulation dangerous. In essays with titles like The Walt Disney World Underground and A Cowboy in Tomorrowland, The City as Theme Park, scholars analyze the tunnels as part of a broader cultural pattern: visible respectability and aesthetic control on the surface, supported by invisible service infrastructure below. These academic analyses treat the Utilidor not as trivia or as merely a curious feature of a famous theme park, but as infrastructure history, equivalent in conceptual and engineering significance to urban renewal projects, interstate highway construction, and other massive civil engineering undertakings of the post-war era. The tunnels represent a particular approach to managing the tension between fantasy and function, between the desire for immersive entertainment environments and the practical necessity of logistics, maintenance, and worker circulation. Scholars note that Walt Disney's solution, building the park 1 story above grade and burying all backstage functions, reflected the same modernist confidence in technology and planning that shaped urban policy throughout the 1960s, the belief that careful design and substantial capital investment could eliminate disorder, inefficiency, and visual clutter. Next to these academic articles and bibliographies and reference lists might appear the 1967 Walt Disney World Background and Philosophy Report, portions of which have been preserved in scanned form and circulated through research networks, and transportation studies like the Texas A&M report that listed Walt Disney World Utilidors as a case study in common utility ducting. Together, these documents treat the tunnel system not as a secret successfully kept, but as a documented historical phenomenon, analyzed and contextualized alongside other infrastructure projects that shaped 20th century American landscapes. In this scholarly context, individuals like William Joe Potter and John Hench reappear not as colorful characters in corporate lore, but as names in footnotes and citations, engineers and designers whose specific decisions about water tables, tunnel widths, sight lines, and spatial organization shaped outcomes that persist decades later. Potter's biography, documented in U.S. Army Corps of Engineers publications noting his post-military career at Disney World, positions him within a broader cohort of military engineers who applied wartime and civil engineering expertise to post-war development projects. Hench's writings on themed entertainment and spatial design, collected in books and corporate publications, provide primary source evidence for understanding the aesthetic philosophy that made the Utilidor system seem necessary rather than optional. The recurring visual motif that had organized movement through the tunnel since 1971, the painted stripe on the wall, shows up in photographs filed in archives under simple descriptive labels: Utility Corridor, Disney World, Backstage Circulation, Magic Kingdom, Service Tunnel Interior. These images sit alongside photographs of other utility tunnels worldwide, part of a global typology where painted lines serve as low-cost wayfinding devices in monotonous subterranean spaces. The stripe, from this archival perspective, loses its specific connection to Disney magic and becomes instead an example of a common infrastructural solution to a common problem: how to help people navigate environments without landmarks, windows, or natural light. Architectural historians examining these materials note both what the utilidors achieved and what they required. They achieved Walt Disney's goal of complete aesthetic control, eliminating visual evidence of backstage functions and creating a seamless guest experience where nothing broke the narrative illusion. But they required massive capital expenditure, earth-moving on a scale comparable to dam construction, millions of dollars in concrete and utility installation, ongoing ventilation and maintenance costs, and they proved difficult to replicate, which is why later Disney parks abandoned comprehensive utilidor systems in favor of cheaper, more flexible alternatives. The archive, then, presents the utilidors as a singular experiment, successful within its specific context, influential on theme park design philosophy, but ultimately too expensive and complex to become a standard template. The tunnels remain operational more than 50 years after construction, a testament to solid engineering and Disney's substantial maintenance budgets, but they also remain unique, never fully repeated at comparable scale in any of the dozens of theme parks built worldwide since the Magic Kingdom opened. Seen through archival eyes, the Utilidor is less a secret carefully guarded and more a case study available for analysis, a moment when entertainment architecture borrowed tools and concepts from infrastructural modernity and applied them to the peculiar problem of maintaining fantasy. The castle above appears in Cinderella postcards and tourist photographs, celebrated and reproduced endlessly. The tunnel below appears in engineering diagrams, transportation research papers, and architectural studies, documented with equal care but for different audiences, serving different purposes. Both, in their respective archives, tell stories about how far the Walt Disney Company was willing to go to keep a cowboy from walking through Tomorrowland. The graduate student in the reading room, comparing the Utilidor schematic to site plans and photographs spread across the table, sees infrastructure shaped by a specific vision at a specific moment. Late 1960s optimism about planning and technology, combined with entertainment industry obsession with narrative control, producing 9 acres of underground corridors designed to disappear from public awareness. That the tunnels are now discussed in academic papers, featured in guided tours and mapped by enthusiasts online, represents not failure of the original vision, but evolution of how that vision is remembered and interpreted. The architecture endures. The secrecy is transformed into managed disclosure and scholarly documentation. In another century, when theme parks may operate on entirely different principles, when digital projection might replace physical sets, when automated systems might eliminate much of the human labor that currently fills the utilidors during operating hours, these documents will remain. Blueprints, photographs, research papers, oral histories. The painted stripe on the wall, preserved in images archived by libraries and cultural institutions, will continue to mark the boundary between a world designed to be photographed and shared and a world designed to vanish, except that nothing, finally, vanishes completely. Everything leaves traces. Every monument built to defy visibility eventually becomes paperwork, preserved and cataloged and available for study by anyone curious enough to unfold the aging photocopies and ask what stories they might tell. Somewhere beneath Cinderella Castle in Bay Lake in 2025, a cast member in an unremarkable polo shirt and ID badge walks along a corridor marked with a green band edged in yellow. To her, the stripe is just a wayfinding tool, as familiar and unremarkable as a street sign or a subway map. She knows that green leads toward her assigned break room, that yellow marks a cross corridor toward costuming, that red would take her toward a different zone entirely. She learned this color system during her first week of training, practiced it until the routes became automatic, and now navigates the tunnels without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding her through turns while her mind thinks about other things, the task waiting when her break ends, plans for the evening, the conversation she just had with a coworker in the Mao's cafeteria. To a historian examining photographs of these same corridors, the stripe carries entirely different meanings. It is the single architectural motif that encodes the entire story of the Utilidor system, a minimal visual mark that organizes geography, directs labor, and embodies hierarchy. Training booklets and backstage photographs from the 1970s onward depict that same band of color as background texture, never the subject of the image, always present at the edge of the frame. In modern blog posts and behind-the-scenes presentations, the stripe finally steps into the spotlight, called out as evidence that the tunnels were designed with the same attention to detail as the themed lands above, that even spaces guests would never see reflected Disney's commitment to comprehensive environmental design. In philosophical terms, the stripe functions as a visible sign of invisible control. It tells workers where they are permitted to go and, by implication, where boundaries lie between different operational zones. Just as sightlines and carefully planted berms on the surface guide guests toward some views and away from others, channeling movement and attention according to narrative priorities, the Utilidor stripe channels cast members along predetermined paths, ensuring that the cowboy heading toward Frontierland does not accidentally emerge in Tomorrowland, that the character performer in a mouse costume finds the correct stage entrance, that the maintenance worker pushing a cart of supplies reaches the right stockroom without getting lost in an otherwise featureless maze. When John Hench wrote and spoke about the Magic Kingdom as a total experience engaging every sense, designing environments where guests would be completely immersed in constructed realities that blocked out the ordinary world, the Utilidor stripe was part of that totality, an unseen piece of show that maintained the coherence of the visible performance. It was infrastructure as narrative device, paint on concrete serving the same function as forced perspective on castle towers or carefully composed background music in themed lands, directing attention, shaping experience, ensuring that every element reinforced the intended story. Over time, the paint flakes and fades. Maintenance crews repaint during slow periods, matching colors to faded originals, maintaining consistency across decades of wear. The stripe adapts to small layout changes. When a new stockroom opens, when a corridor gets reconfigured to accommodate updated utility lines, when operational needs shift and departments relocate within the tunnel network. But the underlying concept remains stable, unchanged since the Utilidors opened in 1971. Color codes still organize space, painted lines still guide workers through windowless passages. The system endures because it solves a persistent problem: how to move thousands of people through a confusing underground network efficiently, safely, and with minimal training. If the Utilidors are ever decommissioned, if at some future point Disney decides to rebuild the Magic Kingdom on different infrastructural principles, or if economic or technological changes make the tunnel system obsolete, that stripe may be all that survives in physical form. A section of concrete wall, carefully salvaged before demolition, preserved in a museum exhibit about theme park architecture or mid-century entertainment infrastructure. A fragment showing the painted band, perhaps with a descriptive plaque, explaining how this simple wayfinding device organized one of the most famous hidden spaces in American popular culture. Even that outcome, if it occurs generations from now, would represent a kind of victory for the architecture. Most infrastructure disappears without trace when it is replaced. Utility tunnels get filled in. Old pipes are removed and forgotten. Abandoned subway stations sit dark and empty beneath cities, known only to urban explorers and transit historians. But the Utilidor stripe, because of its association with Disney and because of the company's careful management of its own history and brand identity, might persist as an artifact, a physical object preserved and exhibited, a fragment of concrete carrying a thin line of pigment that once meant this way to Fantasyland to workers who followed it daily. In a palace or cathedral, architectural historians identify recurring motifs in the ornamentation: carved acanthus leaves, repeated geometric patterns in floor mosaics, symbolic figures on capitals and corbels. These elements, analyzed and catalogued, reveal the aesthetic language and cultural values of the builders. In the Utilidor, a space designed purely for function, stripped of ornament, built to be unseen, the recurring motif is even simpler. A painted line on concrete, color-coded and maintained, organizing movement through space with minimal visual means. Its endurance over 5 decades, its persistence in photographs and tour narratives, its elevation from functional detail to cultural symbol, quietly reminds us that even the most magical experiences depend on infrastructure drawn where most people will never look. The castle above gets photographed millions of times per year, appears on advertisements in merchandise and in films establishing Florida as location. The stripe below appears in far fewer images, seen by far fewer eyes, but carries no less significance for the people whose daily work depends on following it correctly. Architecture has hierarchies. Some elements face the public and carry aesthetic, symbolic, and cultural weight. Other elements remain backstage, valued for performance rather than appearance. But both are equally real, equally essential to how buildings function and what they communicate. The Utilidor stripe occupies that secondary tier. Unglamorous, utilitarian, easy to overlook or dismiss as mere maintenance detail. Yet it has organized decades of labor, guided millions of footsteps, and maintained the boundary between onstage fantasy and backstage reality every single day since the Magic Kingdom opened. That is the work infrastructure does. It persists, often invisibly, enabling the experiences we remember while remaining absent from memory itself. Guests recall the castle, the fireworks, the parade down Main Street. Cast members recall following the green stripe to the break room, the yellow stripe to costuming, the stripe that led them through the tunnels toward whatever role they were assigned that day. One memory is about magic. The other is about paint on concrete. Both are true. Both matter. Only one usually gets told. On an ordinary evening in 2025, as guests stream out of the Magic Kingdom toward the ferryboats waiting across the Seven Seas Lagoon, the slope beneath their feet carries them gradually downward from the elevated second floor of the park back to the natural grade of Central Florida. They descend through the tunnel beneath the railroad station, tired and satisfied after a long day of attractions and entertainment, carrying shopping bags and pushing strollers, comparing favorite moments and planning tomorrow's activities. The transition feels seamless, natural, simply the way this landscape works. Nothing in the pavement or the carefully designed exit sequence suggests they have just walked off the roof of a 9-acre utility tunnel network designed in the 1960s, specifically to keep their experience pure. No plaque marks the spot where surface level meets grade. No signage explains that Main Street USA exists 14 feet above the surrounding land, built on fill excavated from the lake they are now approaching. No display acknowledges the AVAC room that swallowed every piece of trash they discarded during their visit, or the costuming department that dressed every character they hugged for photographs, or the color-striped corridors where thousands of cast members in different uniforms have just finished evening shifts and are heading toward locker rooms and employee parking lots, following painted lines through fluorescent-lit passages as they have every day since the park opened more than 50 years ago. The architecture has done its work perfectly. Guests experienced a themed environment so complete, so carefully controlled, that they never questioned how it functioned, never wondered where the trash went, or how cast members reached their positions, or what systems enabled the air conditioning that kept indoor attractions comfortable despite brutal Florida humidity. They simply enjoyed the park, trusted that everything would work, and accepted the magic as though it required no machinery, no labor, no infrastructure beyond what they could see on the surface. From a certain perspective, the perspective of American Gilded Age estates with their vast servant wings and hidden service stairs, this is not a new architectural strategy, but an old one, adapted to modern purposes. The great mansions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries separated spaces rigorously. Family and guests occupied showrooms. with elaborate decoration, soaring ceilings, expensive materials, and views of manicured landscapes, while servants moved through narrow back stairs, worked in basement kitchens, and lived in attic rooms designed to keep them invisible except when their labor was specifically required. The architecture encoded status and reinforced social hierarchy, making inequality spatial, built into the walls and floors and circulation patterns of the house itself. Disney's Utilidor system, viewed through this historical lens, performs a similar function but inverts the class dynamics. At a Gilded Age estate, wealth and leisure occupied the visible, beautiful spaces. Labor occupied the hidden, utilitarian ones. At the Magic Kingdom, paying guests, people of all economic classes, at least in theory, though admission prices limit access, occupy the visible, beautiful park, while Disney employees occupy the hidden, utilitarian tunnels. The boundary between onstage and backstage is a boundary between consumer and worker, between those who experience leisure and those who produce it, between the people whose enjoyment justifies the entire enterprise and the people whose labor makes that enjoyment possible. Yet the analogy only goes so far. Gilded Age servants had little choice about their working conditions and limited options for other employment. Disney cast members, for all the challenges of hourly wages and demanding physical work, choose this employment and can leave for other jobs if they wish. The Utilidors, for all their hidden quality, are not inherently oppressive spaces. They are functional infrastructure, well lit and maintained, designed to make cast members' work more efficient and comfortable by keeping them out of Florida heat and separating them from guest crowds. The color-coded stripes help rather than hinder workers, providing clear navigation through complex spaces. Philosophical questions remain. Why must joy be produced invisibly? Why must the machinery that sustains themed entertainment be so thoroughly hidden that even acknowledging its existence seems to threaten the experience? Is there something about fantasy that requires ignorance of how it is made, or is this simply Disney's particular approach, one choice among many possible ways to organize a theme park? Other parks, after all, do not bury their infrastructure so completely. Other entertainment venues accept some visibility of backstage functions without destroying guests' enjoyment. Disney's answer, embedded in the Utilidor's design and in 50 years of operational philosophy, insists that complete immersion requires complete invisibility of anything that breaks the fictional world. The cowboy cannot walk through Tomorrowland. The trash truck cannot roll down Main Street. The cast member cannot be seen in ordinary clothes eating lunch on a bench in Fantasyland. Every such violation, no matter how minor, creates a crack in the illusion, a moment when guests remember they are in a theme park rather than a Magic Kingdom, when commercial reality intrudes on purchase fantasy. The Utilidor system was designed to prevent those cracks, to maintain seamless illusion at any cost, and the costs proved substantial. Millions of dollars in construction, ongoing maintenance, and operational expenses. A template so expensive it was never fully repeated, all to keep backstage out of sight, to ensure that guests never have to think about the labor and infrastructure that makes their leisure possible. Decades from now, the castle silhouette may still be recognizable even if every other element of the park has been updated with new technologies, new attractions, new entertainment formats that we cannot yet imagine. Digital projection might replace physical sets. Automated systems might eliminate much of the human labor currently required. The park might eventually function on entirely different principles, shaped by different technologies and different expectations about what entertainment should be. But the tunnels below, if they survive, will remain artifacts of an earlier era. The concrete corridors and utility racks will reflect the engineering standards and technologies of the late 1960s. The painted stripes will mark routes designed for human navigation, designed before GPS and digital wayfinding, designed when paint on concrete was the most practical solution to helping people find their way through underground mazes. Future facilities managers, if Disney continues operating the Magic Kingdom a century from now, will face choices about whether to maintain this aging infrastructure or replace it with something more efficient, more adaptable, better suited to whatever operational needs emerge. What will remain, regardless, are records. Maps in archives noting grounds area 9 acres, Photographs of painted stripes running along concrete walls, cataloged in collections documenting theme park architecture and entertainment history. Technical reports describing the system's design and operation, academic papers analyzing its cultural and infrastructural significance. Oral histories from cast members who spent decades following those stripes through the tunnels. Together, these documents will preserve the Utilidor long after the physical structure has been replaced or abandoned, ensuring that even invisible architecture eventually becomes visible through historical study. We began, 70 chapters ago, with a moment in 1971, standing in a concrete corridor under a new castle, listening to the hum of AVAC fans and muffled music from above, watching a cast member in costume follow a painted stripe toward a stage entrance. We end with a similar stillness, projected forward. A future visitor, perhaps an archivist or preservationist, or simply someone curious about how entertainment was produced in the late 20th century, standing in a museum in front of a framed Utilidor blueprint or examining a salvaged section of painted tunnel wall. The castle will be represented by photographs, by digital reconstructions, by the countless images capturing its iconic silhouette. The stripe will be represented by a fragment of concrete, by archived construction documents, by memories preserved in interviews and institutional records. Every monument built to defy time eventually becomes paperwork, fragments, and memory. Even in Disney World, perhaps especially there, where so much effort goes into maintaining illusions of timelessness, where architecture and landscaping and daily maintenance all work toward preserving a sense of eternal present. The passage of years makes itself felt. Paint fades, concrete ages, technologies become obsolete. What seemed permanent and unchanging when first built gradually reveals itself as temporal, contingent, subject to the same forces of entropy and replacement that affect every human construction. The Magic Kingdom may be famous for existing on the second floor, elevated above reality, building fantasy atop an artificial ground plane. But the most revealing story lies one level below, in the 9 acres of tunnels built to vanish from awareness and now preserved, paradoxically, because we cannot stop documenting them, mapping them, analyzing them, trying to understand what they meant and what they reveal about us. The Utilidors were designed to disappear. Instead, they have become one of the most discussed, documented, and studied elements of the entire resort, proof that even invisible infrastructure eventually demands to be seen, understood, and remembered. The architecture endures for now. The stripe still guides cast members through underground passages. The AVAC system still pulls trash through pneumatic tubes at highway speed. The costuming department still stores tens of thousands of garments along tunnel walls. The Mouseketeria still serves meals to workers between shifts. And somewhere in the network, at this moment, someone is walking through fluorescent-lit corridors following a painted line, just as thousands of others have done every day for more than half a century, sustaining the fantasy above through their invisible circulation below. That is the Utilidor's final legacy. Not perfection achieved, not problem solved permanently, but a specific solution to a specific challenge: how to preserve theatrical illusion in a commercial entertainment venue, executed with extraordinary thoroughness and preserved through decades of operation. It worked. It still works. And whether it continues to work 50 years from now, or whether future generations find better solutions to the same problems, the maps and photographs and painted stripes will remain as evidence that for one moment in history, at one theme park in Florida, someone decided that keeping a cowboy out of Tomorrowland was worth building an entire city underground. The castle stands above. The tunnels spread below. Between them, painted lines on concrete walls organize the boundary between magic and machinery, between what guests see and what makes that seeing possible. Both levels are real, both are necessary, and both, finally, are equally fragile. Monuments not to eternity, but to human effort and ambition, built to last as long as someone finds them worth maintaining, and destined to become, eventually, historical artifacts that future generations will study and try to understand, asking what we wanted, what we built, and what we thought would endure.